If at all familiar with the character Largo Winch, the billionaire in blue jeans, English-speaking audiences most likely know him either from his TV or movie adaptations. However, the character originally appeared in a series of French-language novels written in the late 1970s by Belgian writer Jean Van Hamme. These novels were not particularly commercially successful. However, Largo would return in a comic book series after Jean Van Hamme became a particularly successful comic book writer. Over here, I have the first editions of the French versions of volumes 7 and 8 of Largo Winch, Fort Makiling and Eye of the Tiger, when you translate the titles, published by the Repérages imprint of Dupuis. Please forgive my pronunciation of French. I am not a native French speaker, but I will try my best. I also have here how I first encountered this story in the English version published by Cinebook. As you can see, there's only one book here, and it has the number 4 on the spine. This is because the English publisher decided to publish the translations of each individual two-part story as 2-in-1s for the first 4 volumes. Volumes 5 and 6 reprint separately volumes 9 and 10 of the French version in the English version, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Aside from the obvious differences, such as this being quite significantly smaller, fairly close to the size of an American comic book, although slightly wider, closer actually to a manga magazine, which is the B5 International Standard Paper size, and also being paperback. There are several other differences between these two editions, which I will showcase now. Firstly, the back covers are different, aside from the text being in different languages. The French language version features this illustration by the illustrator Philippe Francq, and the English version features this $100 bill background, a large Largo Winch logo, as well as pictures and select bibliographies of the illustrator and writer, and an age rating and a price in dollars, which is quite strange given that this is a British edition. Also strange given this is a British edition is the orientation of the text on the spine, which goes from bottom to top. Typically, books published in English originally have their spine text oriented from top to bottom, much like, weirdly enough, these French books. So the text orientation on these spines are the inverse of what one would usually expect of books published in their respective languages. Despite already having a suggested minimum age to read this comic, the English edition does have a note here that says, with the author's consent, certain illustrations have been changed from the original version to this English version. What they are referring to is censorship of some minor nudity present in the French version, which is altered in the English version. Cinebook has been heavily criticized for this censorship of this and other comics. However, I think there are more serious problems than some unintrusive adaptation in this English version. Although I do think it's not completely bad. I actually prefer the more matte paper texture of the English version compared to the glossier paper texture of the French version. And I also prefer that it's published as a single volume than 2 separate ones. The problems I do have with this is that despite having a pretty decent translation, there is actually a grammatical mistake or perhaps a typo on this page in this panel over here. I will let you read that yourself. And it also, on the copyright page, omits the credit of the colorist, which I think is quite a glaring issue, even more serious than the issue of glare I have in this video. In the French edition, the colorist is credited as being Marie-Paul Alloer. Also on the copyright page of the French edition is an acknowledgement of Marcel Crabbe, a former associate member of the New York Stock Exchange, who helped compose these accounts of the W Group, which is the corporation that the protagonist Largo Winch inherits, which are written in English, ironically enough, in the French edition, as the W Group is an American conglomerate. There is also an acknowledgement that the stories of Largo Winch, at least for the first few volumes are liberal adaptations of the books by the same author published by Editions Mercure of France. The main difference, aside from adding pictures between this and the novel, which I have not read, is that the setting in the original novel is the Philippines, whereas here it is in Myanmar. The French editions also featured these title pages with black and white versions of a panel from the inside of the story, in this case on page 29. And in the case of this one, it's from the first story page. I say first story page as this volume features a recap page, which is not included in the English version, as that would be redundant. Instead, the English version reprints, also slightly redundantly actually, the cover of the second volume to indicate that it is part of the second volume, like this. The second volume of the French version, aside from these exclusive illustrations by Philippe Francq, features an epigraph from Nobel Prize winner Albert Camus, which says something along the lines of, forgive my translation, "The ends justify the means, but what justifies the ends?" There, curiously, in the French version, there is actually a reference in the text to the Nobel Prize, which is actually omitted from the English version. I first encountered Largo Winch for a very good deal of only 50 rand, which is slightly under €3, in 2023 at the very first comic convention I attended, and was attracted by the bright colors and very lovely illustrations by Philippe Francq and Alouer. So I decided to give it a try. I haven't read the other volumes, hence my glossing over of the story. However, I do recommend reading Story Without a Hero by the same author, which is from the late 1970s, much like the original novel. I think this is far more accessible and has a better broad appeal than Largo Winch. It's a survival story, essentially featuring the survivors of a plane crash in the Amazon rainforest. I have linked below two videos, one concerning Story Without a Hero as a recommendation, and another concerning a Largo Winch series overview if it does interest you. You may be wondering what possessed me to buy books in a language that I cannot read, and quite simply it is the drawings. Seeing the drawings at a larger size and in such splendid color, I really enjoyed, and hence my purchasing of these from a secondhand shop. That about does it for the differences between the editions. But if you were wondering whether a winch, the device and not the character, appears in the series, click off now to avoid spoilers. It actually does late in the second volume, close to the conclusion of the story. They actually do use a winch to access a hidden rope bridge to cross a canyon. So it does live up to the title. Anyhow, I hope you found this comparison of two very similar books to be somewhat interesting, and I hope you have a good day.